Welcome back to another episode of my Python tutorial series. My name is Eliaza and this is the EA Lego Academy channel. So in our last video we did a mini project whereby we looked at how we could create a mini banking system using the JSON model and the OS model. And we saw how we could persist our data. We could send data to a JSON file and retrieve data from a JSON file. So today we're going to be looking at how we can test our code. We want to see how we can test our code. So now we have a module in Python for testing code. So most programmers or most people who deal with large projects such as creating applications and games, large projects for production, most of the time they test their code. So they test if their code meets certain requirements or if their codes function as expected. So now we're going to be looking at how we can test our code in Python using a module called the unit test. So now this module has a class called the test case, and this class has some functions that we would need to override. So when we talk about overriding a function, an existing function, is when we are creating a class that extends or inherits from another class or is an extension of a class. Now the class acting as an extension, if it's going to use any of the functions in the pre-existing class, it will need to override those pre-existing functions in order to modify their code. So that I don't bore you with a lot of theory, let's just get started. So now I'm assuming that you have been following my tutorial using the PyCharm integrated development environment, and you followed my last tutorial on the banking system. So we made a few corrections and all that. So now we want to look at how we can test our code. So you want to come here to the folder because I am assuming that you have opened up your PyCharm. So after opening up your PyCharm, you want to navigate to the folder that you used to follow along the tutorial. Right click on that folder and you want to come here to new. Now you want to come down here to Python file and you want to give it a name. So I will call it testing code. All right. So now before we start, we have some functions that this test case class has. So we have a test case class gotten from the unit test class. Sorry, we have a test case class gotten from the unit test module, and we want to look at some functions inside this test case class. Now the first function is asset equal. Asset equal. So now this function allows us to check or confirm if the value of a variable or if a value is equivalent to another value or is equal to another value. And of course, we know that I showed you the two various ways we could test for equivalent. That is, I showed you a distinction between the assignment operator and the equivalent operator. Then you can create a variable called name, assign it a value of Jack, and then you can check if that value is equivalent to another value, such as doing something like this: name is equivalent to Jack. So most of the time, now this is a comparison operator. The equivalence or the equivalent operator is a comparison operator, checking if the value on the left is the same as the value on the right. So if you are not able to recall, or if it's not clear to you, or if it doesn't sound familiar to you, it shows that you haven't been following my tutorial. But you can save yourself the stress and go back to my video when I talked about conditional statements. So I explicitly explained comparison operators. Comparison operators, obviously, the equivalent, the greater than equal to, less than equal to. So go back to those previous videos and get familiar. So without further ado rather, the asset equal allows us to check if a value is the same as another value. Then we have another function, asset not equal. Now this function allows us to check if a value is not the same as another value. Then we have the asset true. of course. So it allows us to check if the condition returned by a function is valid. That is, if the condition is true. So it doesn't now the execution of a program within that condition is not of importance. What is important is that it's trying to check if the condition that governs the execution of that program, if it is true. From the name, as the name implies, assert true. We're trying to check if the condition is valid or true. And if it's true, then it means that we're going to have a successful test. So mind you, we are looking at testing our code. We are not really concerned with logic and all that. So I would not be making the code complex. I'll just be showing you how you can write your programs, the different type of ways you can write your programs, and how you can test them appropriately. So now the next one is assert false. Of course, the assert false is the opposite of the assert true. So the assert false allows us to check if a condition if the condition of a program, if it is not true, that is, if it's false, if it's not valid. So, and of course, we know that if we attach a program to a conditional statement and that conditional statement is not true, we know from experience from my past tutorials that that program would not get executed. So it allows us to confirm, we are checking that that program is not true. Then we have the assert in. So now, mind you, all these functions that I am stating, they are all gotten from the test case class. So of course, we are inheriting from the test case, and we have the ability to override previously existing functions in the test case class. From your knowledge of object-oriented programming, so taking me back to that tutorial, I didn't get any likes. I wouldn't know why, but if you are really interested to understand this particular tutorial, testing your code or your program, you need to go back to that and watch it, understand the concept there, and like it. So it will do you a lot of good to be able to understand what I'm talking about here. Yeah. So assert in allows us to check if a value is inside a list. So we're trying to check if a value or if an element is in a list. Then we have the assert not in, which allows us to check if a value is not inside a list. So now, without further ado, let's get started. Now, the first thing I want to do is to import the module called unit test. Unit test, and of course, I want to write the variety of programs that I'm trying to test. I'll write the first one. So I'm going to create a program that allows me to just print out the sentence. So I'll just give a parameter. You can remember from your knowledge of functions, again, referring you back to my previous tutorials on functions, you would understand what this is. This is a parameter, this is the function name, this is the def keyword, or we can say def statement gives us the ability to create our own function. So def is just a short word in Python for definition, or your function definition. You can come here and say print hello there. So I'll be using an f string. Now, also again, referring you back to my previous tutorial on string formatting to tell you exactly what I'm doing. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to read the value stored inside here. Of course, when I call this function, I will need to assign a value here, and that will be the value here. Now, there's one little thing that we should note here. This is wrong. Now, the reason why it's wrong is that when you are trying to test a function, you must make sure that that function is returning back some value. The function is not allowed to print out anything. Instead, it's allowed or permitted to return a value. And the next one, I'll just call it condition, because I'm trying to ensure that condition is valid. Now I'll come here and say um, if age is greater than 4, what am I returning? I'm returning back you are able to vote. If I'm passing a value that is correct, of course, I'll be showing you how we can apply each of these to our program. Now create another function again that, of course, returns back a list. I'll just call it container. Of course, I would not give it any parameter, and you see why. Returning back a list that has some elements: Alex, James, Sam, David. Now, on to the main event. Now, I'm going to create a class and I will call it mini test. Mini test. Now, this class is going to be inheriting from the test case class. Now, the test case class has some. This is, mind you, this is how you inherit if you have forgotten inheritance. And of course, like I said, in order for you to remember this and refresh your memory, you need to go back to my tutorial on object-oriented programming. So I'll come here and I'll create the setup method. So now there's a function called setup. The function called setup in the test case class. Now, because I'm inheriting from the test case class, accessing functions from this class, I have the ability to use the setup method. Now, the setup method works similar to your initializer or your init function when we look at classes. So of course, to do a recap, the initializer is a function that is created automatically upon the execution of a class in Python. So the setup method is the test case class's own version of the initializer. So this is where you create parameters or attributes that would be used throughout the stages, the various stages of your test. So I'm going to create, now of course we know what the self means. The self means that that attribute or parameter belongs to the class. And because my mini test is inheriting from the test case class, it simply means that anything I write with the self is an attribute belonging to the mini test class and also the test case class. I will just say data and I will create a list and I'll tell you why I did this. So I'll have Lucas, Anthony, Sam, and Alex. All right. Now, when you are trying to create functions or methods that is methods that you want to use to test your program, and these are the three functions I'm trying to test. I'm trying to test their validity. I'm trying to test for their set equal, trying to test for their set not equal, I'm trying to test for their set true, for their set false, their set in, and their set not in. Now, when you are trying to use methods to test, functions to test, because we use functions within the class inheriting from the test case class to test our program. When we are writing these functions start with the test underscore. So it's a must. It must start with the test underscore, or else that program would not be tested. You will get a failed test. So you want to make sure that the function that you are trying to write, your own customized function, whichever name you want to give it, before you write the name, it must be preceded with the test underscore. So that's what I want to do. So I will create a test underscore, and I will call it message one. So I'm testing the message function. Now I will create a variable, I'll call it data, and I will pass this sentence because I'm trying to check if it's equal. So the very first test I'm trying to do is to check if a value is equal to another value. I'm trying to run the asset equal. So I'm trying to check if this value being returned by this function, if it's really equal to another value. So now this sentence writes hello there, something, of course, and I'll come here and I'll say message, the function name, Alex. So now I'm going to try to do something. I'll come here and say self dot asset equal, set equals. I'm going to check if this value data is equal to hello there Alex. Hello there Alex. Now you can see that they are equal because this was my function that was being returned message, and I gave it a value of Alex. And of course we know that from our past tutorials that when you print out a function returning a value, it does the same work as if you have assigned a value to a variable, and to print out that value that the function is returning. And of course, you can see that here, this I passed Alex as the argument for this parameter. So automatically, if I should execute this function, it's going to print out hello there, Alex. So I've assigned it to a variable data. So this data is holding that hello there, Alex. And I'm checking if what data is holding hello there, Alex is equivalent to hello there, Alex. Of course, they are equivalent. So I will get a successful test. But just hold that thought. We're not executing our test just yet. I want to carry out another test again, underscore, and I'll say message 2. Now, what I'm trying to do here is that I'm trying to check if the value returned by this function, if it is not equal to another value. Of course, I have to ensure that it is not equal so that I can get a successful test. I'll come here and I'll give it done. Now come here and say self. Now the reason why I'm saying self is because they all belong to. The reason why I'm saying self is that they all belong. They all belong to. This call is coming. Sorry for that. So the reason why I'm saying self is because now this class is inheriting from the test case class, and the test case class has these functions, and I'm trying to override them. So as I'm overriding these methods, of course, the mini test class is now representing my test case class. So any function already existing in the test case class, the mini test class can access them. It has the ability to access them. In short, they belong to the mini test class, obviously. I'm sure what I'm saying makes sense. If you create a class and you're trying to inherit from that class, the class carrying out the inheritance automatically has access all the objects in that class being inherited from. And of course, in programming, we treat everything as an object. I hope I am making sense. If I am not, go back to my previous tutorials and you would understand. I said not equal. So I'll come here and I'll say data. So I'm trying to check if the value returned here. So now scrolling back up, you will see that the sentence that will be printed out would be hello there, John. And I'm trying to check if hello there, John is not equal to hi there, Mr. Of course, they are not equal, so this will give me a successful test. But again, hold that thought. We are not done. Now, I've showed you the asset equals and the asset not equals. Now, there were 4 other functions I talked about that allow us to test our program. We have the asset true and the asset false. We are trying to check if values or conditions if conditions in programs, if they are true or false. So for the asset true, you are trying to check if the condition is true. For the asset false, you are trying to check if the condition is false. All right, so you come here and you create a function. So don't forget, your programs all start with a test underscore. I'll call it condition 1. All right, so you come here and you can create a variable that will represent your condition function. I'll give it data just to be on the safe side so that we would not have an overtly complex program. Say condition, I'll give it 40. Of course, since I'm checking for asset true, I have to make sure that the condition is true. So if you go back to your program, you will see that the parameter age, the condition was that age needs to be greater than 34 before this program can get executed. In other words, this condition needs to be true. And since I'm checking for asset true, I have to make sure that it is true because whatever value I assign to age, to the parameter age, would automatically fit in here. So it would be similar to me checking if 40 is greater than 34 and 40 really is greater than 34. So you come here and say self dot asset asset true, and you pass data. Of course, you have to make sure that it's um you come here in the def test underscore condition 2. Of course, we're checking all the types of conditions. You come here and you see data is equal to condition. You have to make sure that the condition is false. So I'll give it 30. 30 is not greater than 34. This will give you this should give you a passed test as well. So I'll say set false and I'll pass data. All right. Now we're getting there. We're almost there. So this is going to be a very short and straightforward tutorial. Now, the next thing I want to check is asset in and asset not in. So this allows us to check if some element is inside the list or not. That is for the asset in, is that you're trying to check if an element is in a list. Then for the asset false, you're trying to check if an element is not inside a list. That's it. So now I'm going to try to, now since this function is returning back a list automatically, I know that I would, whichever variable I assign this function to, that variable will represent my list. So I'll come here and say def test. Don't forget, your function must start with test underscore. I'll call it list1. I'll come here and I'll create a variable data is equal to container. Now I'll come here and I'll say self asset in. Now, all right. So now I'm trying to check if an element in this function, this my setup method, is inside this variable. Now, why did I do this? I did this because all these functions here for my test message 1, test message 2, test condition 1, and test condition 2, I did it so that they can all access this list. You know, I told you that the setup method is similar to your initializer in a class. So it simply means that all functions in that class can access this variable. And that's the reason why I'm going to do that. So I want to check if the elements are the, so this, well, let me use this. So I want to check if the elements are the 0, 1, 2, at the 2 index. From your knowledge of list, you can still remember, I said we always start counting at the 0 index. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3. And the last element is always at the -1 index. So -1, -2, -3, -4. So using the positive side, 0, 1, 2. I want to check if Sam is inside this list. Of course, Sam is here because I'm using asset in. I'm trying to check if it is there. So of course, I have to make sure that it is there. So I'll come down here and say self.data, or rather what's the name of the list? So self.data at the 2 index. So what I'll do, since they're almost alike, in order not to cause confliction, I would rename this one and add 1 to it. So self.data, is it data 1? Trying to check if it is there. And of course, if it is there, I should get a successful test. So test underscore list 2. We come down here and write another, so data 2 container. So now I'm trying to check if an element is not in that my list. Self.asset not in. So self.data. So now I want to check if Lucas is not in the list. So we can see that Lucas is not here. So that will be self data at the 0 index. You come down here and say self data at the 0 index in data 2. Now, since we are done with all the functions that we want to use to test our program, it's time for us to run the test. Now, we have something that we need to explain and we need to understand. So now we have something called if main. So if underscore name is equivalent to underscore main. I'll be explaining what this simply means. Now, what this is trying to say is that if the program you're trying to execute is equal to the first program being executed, name represents the program that is trying to be executed, and main refers to the program being executed. In other words, this refers to the program that you're trying to execute, but you haven't yet executed, and the main refers to the program being executed. Why do I need to do this? Now, the reason is because normally I could have as well just come here and said unit test.main. So we have a function called main, or a class called main. Now it's inside the unit test module. Before I do this, it's inside the unit test module. So in order for us to test our program, for our program to run and show us the successful test, we would need to call the main class inside the unit test module. So I'll come here and say main. Now sometimes this function runs, but for my discovery, I discovered that while I'm using an integrated development environment, specifically PyCharm, for some reason this function does not get executed, and I need that expression, that if name is equal to main. I'm sure you can even see that here. It's even showing me a pop-up that I need to use if name is equal to main. Now, the thing is this code would have gotten executed if I was using an ordinary text editor. Let's say I was using Sublime Text, or I was using Notepad, or I was using some other text editor which is not an IDE. This program would have gotten executed. But for some reason, the time when I tested it using my PyCharm, or the few occasions I did it, it didn't work. But let's try it so that you can see what I'm talking about before we go back to using our normal conventional way of executing or running a test using your PyCharm IDE. So let's run our test and let's see what we'll get. So testing program. All right. So it got executed, although it said run 0 test in 0 seconds. So it did not run any tests. It didn't run any tests. So no tests were found. So you can see that we need to use that if underscore name is equal to main. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'll come here and say if underscore name is equivalent or is equal to underscore main. And of course, I already told you what it means. I said name refers to your program that you are trying to execute, and main refers to the very first execution happening in that your program. Now this should give us successful tests. So you see we got some warnings, although it's not really necessary. It says please use asset equal instead, please use asset not equal instead. But it gave us successful tests. We said run 6 tests in 0.047 seconds. And let's go and confirm that. How many tests did we run? Now, the very first test we checked was the test message 1, which is 1. The next one was test message 2, which was 2. Test condition 1, which was 3. Test condition, which was 4. Although I should have given it test condition 2. Test list, which was test list 1, which was 5. And then test list 2, which was 6. So this just gives us an idea of how we can be able to write a program and test. So bear in mind that if you are using the function to create a test, you must ensure that that function is returning the value. You don't want that function to print out anything, but you want it to return some value that you are going to test, in order to get a successful test. So that is all for the tutorial for today. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button. If you feel that it will be of importance to someone, or you have a friend in the university or someone taking a course in Python, please share. And if you want me to make more content like this, please hit that subscribe button. So till next time, it's goodbye for now.